Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the chance to come and talk to you. And in fact, as some may know, I'm also chair of Scottish Business in the Community, and by a complete coincidence, and it is a genuine coincidence, but a good example of using technology to manage our pretty complicated lives these days. I was just doing a conference call as chair of Scottish Business Community from here with people in London for 15 minutes. And had one been trying to work that without the availability of technology, simple conference call, couldn't have done it. So maybe that's a good wee case study, and it's gotten me off on the day in my typical day of conference calls. What I'm going to do this morning is try and give you a flavour against the four themes that are on the agenda, in fact, which is really a bit of discussion, excuse me, got a bit of frog in my throat, on technologies available, and you know they are coming clearly. I think, secondly, the barriers to new technologies, including video conferencing. But I think more importantly, what I'm going to theme on is the cultural aspects of how, certainly in BT and lots of other organisations, to be honest now, are adapting their organisational culture, work style, people management, to facilitate better exploitation of technology, to avoid things like excessive travel, and indeed travel better, to be honest. And some of the challenges that they pose, because there are some challenges. And underpinned, as Terry said a few minutes ago, by the business case. And just to say, you'll see some slides later, the business case, whilst financially is critical, it isn't just about the financial aspect. So there's a whole series of things around how people behave, feel, and respond to the opportunities that are critical. So if we start by looking at I suppose the strategy of why we went down this route a few years ago. 1992, actually, I worked in computing and BT for many years, and I was one of the very first guinea pigs, long before broadband existed, of accessing stuff remotely with a laptop. 50 people did it. And just to demonstrate how technology, frankly, isn't a barrier, I'll come to that. I was doing that with effectively PSTN line technology. Admittedly, people weren't sending high bandwidth files around the network in those days very much. And when I say access remotely, in the late 90s was in places like America and China on business doing that. But we had several dimensions to why we wanted to do things. First of all, is to reduce our own carbon footprint. We've had a program running really since 1996, where at the time we emitted as a company about 1.6 million tons of CO2. And that's come down consistently. By 2006 was 0.6 million tons. And our objective, and it's going to be pretty tough, frankly, by 2020 is to get to 0.2 million tons as a company globally. And that's done for, I suppose, 2 or 3 main reasons. One is we like to think we're a socially responsible British headquartered company. Secondly, we will shed loads of money, and have been doing so, and make no bones about it. That's, you know, a big factor in all this. And a third, I think when we come to things like travel, and I will come back to it, frankly, if you work in an organisation that is dispersed or you're dealing with people who are dispersed from you as customers or suppliers, you get massive efficiency savings coming out of that. So as part of that journey and as part of that rationale, and this is against a backdrop, by the way, of consuming about 0.7% of the UK's electricity, and energy bills are only going to go up, right? So there's a big incentive financially to deal with that for any organisation. As part of that journey, it's very much about influencing our suppliers to help us, and this isn't about harassing them. Our suppliers of technology components for the network are massively important to how we succeed, so there's a mutual benefit. And secondly, influencing our customers, and that ranges from clearly large customers, corporates, public sector, through to individual consumers. So for example, the latest phones and so on that we're producing out into the market and routers are significantly less carbon intensive than they were even 2 or 3 years ago. And critically, employee engagement. Because I think, and there is a sort of social responsibility dimension to this. Clearly, one wants one's employees in the workplace to do the right thing for the company, but it's a complete no-brainer, frankly, to help them understand what they can do at home or in the community and derived additional benefit as well. And I think any organisation, certainly of any scale in Scotland, has got a big role to play in that, because frankly, unless we get some sort of mass movement on changing our attitude to carbon and travel in Scotland, the government's objectives in Scotland, I suspect, will probably fail. So briefly on technologies, and I do mean briefly because I don't really think technology is a problem. That's just, I suppose, 4 building blocks that we produce. This isn't a BT advertorial. Lots of other companies do the same. The point I'd make is that people get hung up on video. I've got video conferencing facilities in my office out in Edinburgh Park. I probably use video once or twice a year. I use conference calls every working day. I don't use conference calls with people I maybe haven't met, and certainly not with customers I haven't met yet, but I do use them with customers, I do use them with suppliers, and I use them with my people all the time. I have a UK job as well as a BT Scotland job. Of my UK dispersed staff, and they range from Cornwall to Kent to north, up north, one of them works in my office in Edinburgh, right? And I spend, with colleagues as well, my life using conference calls to avoid travel. As I said, I have a British job. I probably have to travel down south to London, typically, or Birmingham or somewhere, twice a month. If I'd gone back 10 or 15 years, that would have probably been 2 days a week. So a complete transformation for me personally, as well as saving money for the company, in how I and tens of thousands of colleagues go about how we deliver our work. However, maybe just a point about things like web and BT streaming services, so that's delivering content over the net. Even for simple things like delivering training in a large organization, particularly where people are dispersed, the vast majority of our training, particularly things like refresh training on telecoms regulation, which everybody has to do, 1 hour video with tests, which you have to do, and you can't cheat the system. I've tried. You've got to go through the process because they change the questions they ask you, is massively effective. And you do it in your own time, at your desk, at home if you want to. And all that sort of thing has fundamentally changed how we actually deliver things like training, and critically, let people undertake that training at a time that's suitable to when they want to do it. So my brief comment about technology is, whilst video conferencing, and particularly good video conferencing, does need high bandwidth, I would suggest that what you ought to be thinking about is questioning whether video conferencing, frankly, is that important. Things like conference calling and streaming services for briefings are really easy, and they're pretty cheap to do. I think there are bigger barriers, right? Technology can be solved. It's getting cheaper all the time. In my experience, and I include within BT in certain parts of it over the years, and I'm sure talking to friends and colleagues in other organisations, the barriers to flexible working and reducing travel mix into this mix in front of you on the screen. It's not unusual to talk to people. It's getting less usual, to be fair, but going back 5 or 10 years, wasn't unusual to talk to very senior people in large organisations who, if they couldn't see someone at the desk, didn't trust them to be doing the job. I mean, how pathetic is that? That's a failure of management. It's not a failure of the individual. It's a failure of a management structure and a performance management structure that gives clarity to what people are meant to achieve in their roles, regardless of where they are. And I keep using this old adage, which I'm sure all of you have heard: work is something you do, not somewhere you go. And that's fundamentally important. If we think differently about what work is and how our relationship with our staff or with our boss is managed, you can do this. It's really not difficult. There are other barriers, isolation and loneliness. On the very odd occasion, I might be working at home for, say, 2 days in a row. It's very unusual, but 1 day is quite common. Living in the south side of Edinburgh, if I don't need to go to my office round the bypass, which sane man would? You just don't go round it. Some people can get isolated and lonely, so I'm not an advocate of vast numbers of people constantly being home workers all the time, because there is a significant need in any organization and with suppliers and customers and contacts to have personal contact. Conference calls can do some of it, but just the buzz you get by mixing with people like today, you will all get some ideas, I hope, from not just me waffling on, but talking to other people, more importantly, about how you can change what you do. So there is a need to meet. Underutilized technology I've spoken about. And there are always concerns about things like privacy and security, health and safety. And it is true, as a line manager of staff all over the country, I have a responsibility, and I have to do my online stuff regularly to do it, to ensure that those of my staff whose official office address is their house, although they're out a lot, is safe and secure for them to do their work, which does require, say, an annual audit. So these are all factors, but I come back to the bottom bullet point, which is that if people have real clarity about what their job is, what their objectives are, what their responsibilities are, including the responsibilities if they're going to be based away from a desk quite a lot. This is all perfectly achievable. And one of the things that's really beginning to become more and more used, I think, in organizations is moving away from this concept of you're a home worker, you're an office worker. What I talk about now, and am personally, is what we would call an agile worker. My wife might argue about the agile, I don't know, but basically it means that you're out and about doing your job wherever you are. I was in a conference call here a few minutes ago. I'll be doing conference calls from house later on. Then I am in the office for a meeting I have to do this afternoon. So you're just working in different locations you need to be. And that slide there really summarizes, I think, the different types of flexible working that I would use to describe really the different opportunities available. I'm probably that nomadic executive one sitting there relaxing in the seat. But you can see there's a mix there. Interestingly, in the call center working model, it's one I'd maybe just highlight as an interesting example, as a bullet point about it later. We've got big call centres across the UK. Biggest ones in Scotland are Glasgow and Dundee, which is growing and very successful and doing a UK role there. We're starting to trial more and more people having the flexibility to be part of that call centre platform, part of that family, but actually work from home some of the time. And that's partly to facilitate them retaining a role. They may have some caring responsibilities, but it's also interesting that when people have the capability to undertake a call center role from home, there is more flexibility about managing peaks and troughs of workload. When you get bad weather, for example, people might say, well, look, I can come on for 2 hours or 3 hours, deal with a peak of work, which if they'd had to commute into, for example, Dundee from Arbroath, then that might not be possible, right? So there are all sorts of business advantages around that are worth thinking about. The other big thing that we're seeing as well, and we'll come onto some of it in one of the slides later, is adopting this model for about 75% of our staff. I mean, every manager's got the capability to do it, and those non-management grades in BT whose jobs support this kind of thing can do it. Call center workers generally don't, but most other people do. 75% of our staff can work flexibly. And the kind of cost savings you can get from avoiding travel, we've worked out on average, and it is an average, it's something about £300 per employee per trip. And that just isn't the rail ticket, it's 21 quid to go to Glasgow. But the big thing for me, and I'm sure it must be true for you, even on occasions when I do have to travel, because I've got technology that is effectively flexible working, that laptop or my BlackBerry, when I'm traveling, I'm effective. But if you're sitting in the M8 driving a car, it's complete dead time. Where if you're on the train, even the slow train to Inverness is quite nice when you get 3 hours offline to do some work. So not to say that travel's never useful, but when we are traveling, the ability to carry on working when you're doing it is a fundamental advantage, which I and my colleagues find really, really helpful. And here's just a brief summary of some of the benefits we've seen over the years. Now, we want to highlight a couple. The productivity thing's interesting. You can read it for yourself. Our analysis over the years is that of the bottom of those 2 bullet points, that general productivity across the workforce has increased by up to 31% and saved, clearly, shed loads of money. I think what's quite interesting, though, just highlighting something on the staff side, if you look at employee retention, whilst the recession's on and organisations are maybe shedding some roles, it is generally true that finding well-skilled people to do more and more complex roles, frankly, sometimes in a more pressurized environment, is becoming harder and harder. So the ability to retain and gain staff is fundamentally important. And I think that bottom bullet point under the employee retention is really, really interesting. Our analysis, and this has gone on for years, this isn't a one analysis wonder, shows that we are retaining 99% of female colleagues who come to work after having had children or a child, right? And that compares to that UK average of about 47%. And that, to me, is phenomenally, A, it's good. I think it's good for female colleagues, but secondly, it's really, really good for the company because people can carry on working. And I've said to 1 or 2 of you before, it's not the first time I've had a conference call with female colleagues with children chattering in the back of the car, right? But hopefully they're not moving at the time. But all these things become possible. Travel you'll see there, but I think, again, absenteeism. Right, our absenteeism rate has gone down quite significantly over the years, below the UK average. And we're certainly seeing less sick leave. You can argue whether that's a good or bad thing, but I know, just being honest about it, if there's a day when you're feeling pretty under the weather, a bit of flu, and it's not that bad, it's quite easy to flip out of bed, go online in the house, do some work, whereas you wouldn't necessarily get showered, dressed, go to the office, and spread the germs around. So, and I think because of people's natural desire to do their job, they don't like to let colleagues down, that capability can make a vast difference, particularly in small organizations, I suspect, where human resources very tight, and the individual, one individual not being in the office might be quite critical to what the organization's trying to do. And the staff morale thing is fundamentally important. As I said, virtually all our managers now will have the capability to work flexibly. Offices are full of hot desks. But this trend that we see, what we call our care study, is a quarterly survey of how people feel about various things in the company, is consistently showing greater job satisfaction, not so much from just being home worker, as I say, that's just one part of it, but from the ability to work in a way that reflects the needs of the business and your personal needs within reason, as long as you're achieving the objectives set out to you by your boss. And that last point is fundamentally critical, because many of my colleagues, and in my own case with my staff, I will not physically see some of the guys or girls that work for me for a month or longer. So unless I've got that capability through management, well, either my management capability, their hard work, and or systems to support me to ensure that the outcomes that the company expects of us are delivered, then clearly things like flexible working wouldn't work. But as I said earlier, I think that's a mindset challenge. I think it's perfectly achievable if people put their mind to it. And finally, just to let you read the bottom thing, London Olympics, I probably shouldn't say it because BT was a sponsor of the Olympics and it was massively successful for Britain and certainly for us, but I avoided going because I didn't need to go to London and have all that hassle to do my job for a month. And it was absolutely fantastic. Yeah? Didn't go and get tickets, didn't go and see it, which is probably sad, but anyway, that's how I coped. So I'd really like to conclude, if I may, by just a couple of summary slides about the enablers and outcomes and conclusions. So on the inner ring there up on the screen is, I suppose, some of the core aspects that I'd like you to think about. So, for example, culture. Really trying to create some culture where the employees have a choice. It's about empowerment and certainly helping people make their own decisions so they don't have to turn around and talk to the boss all the time in the office, which in this modern world is crazy. And critically creating an environment where part of that flexible working strategy is about helping colleagues who, let's face it, in today's world are having to work pretty hard, get greater satisfaction and critically, increasingly retaining staff in the organization. And you can read the rest of it yourself in the slides at your leisure. So, but I do put culture at the heart of this. Technology is important and it's needed, but it's perfectly doable. Thinking about property, and you'll all be in different circumstances, but one of the upstreams of, or outcomes of all this activity, and Mark may talk about it later, I don't know, but I know a lot of local authorities are going through this journey, is the opportunity, if you have a lot of property, is to start shedding it, frankly, because in any organization where you've got a lot of property, that is one of your biggest costs, one of our biggest costs by a significant margin. And that journey we have been on, and most of our offices now that we have are hot desks, and if you came into my office in Edinburgh, you would find 1/3 of the office actually shut down, empty. It's not because there's less people, it's because people are working flexibly, they're not in the office as much, they're just doing their job where they need to be. So hot desking has become a big thing. So I think in conclusion, I'd just say that bar big bandwidth requirements, if you do particularly need video, I mean, all things available at the price, but higher bandwidth is certainly coming to Scotland under well, both industry investment by BT and others, but also as a result of government strategy. Technology like conference calling, streaming is generally speaking not an issue. Culture and people's at the heart of this, so if you are going down this journey of trying to become a more flexibly working organization, avoiding travel, saving money, saving carbon, get the culture and people management right first, because if you don't do that, it won't work. And there needs to be a certain amount of direction from the top. Indeed, it's interesting, Cisco, I think, do, but they certainly did a couple of years ago, big global company, do not allow travel unless it's signed off for internal meetings at all. So that's a sort of mandatory position, and there will always be exceptions, but it's interesting to see that a number of organizations will do that for internal meetings. And in BT, we do that at certain times of the year in certain parts of the business. Drive from the top, and I think critically, and this again is part of the culture, everybody's needs are different. Every organization within every part of large organizations will have different needs, but I think that flexibility, both as a manager and as an employee, about trying to meet individual needs, but at the same time as achieving the outcomes that the organization expects, are a culture that's necessary. I suspect most organizations have it, but if you can underpin what you're doing with that as a sort of value, I suppose, that you may have and your colleagues have, then I think you can achieve a big change in how you use technology to change your travel patterns and actually drive productivity up and costs down. So thanks very much.